This video is a continuation of a video on constructors part 1. This one is the second part. Um, right, so consider you have written a class foo with this declaration. The compiler would be adding a default constructor to foo that has the same access modifier for the class, which is default. So the added constructor also has the default modifier, the same name of that other class with no arguments and with the call to super. In this case, you added a default constructor, right? But the compiler would, as I've discussed in the previous video, if you do not have any call to this args or a super with args, the compiler would add a super call as the first line of code to the constructor. Consider this now. The compiler adds this constructor foo with the access modifier same as that of the class, no arguments, and call to super. Again, right, this is not a default constructor, but the compiler, so this is the first line which should be part of every constructor unless you specify either one of these three. Again, you have everything in place here, so the compiler adds nothing to the constructor. This one is not a constructor, this is just a method call, so the compiler would add a default constructor. Now, considering what should be noted is that abstract classes can have constructors as well. So okay, consider this example. This was talked about in the first video. Okay, if I have a class, so as you could see, class understand call flow doesn't have a constructor, so the compiler added this piece of code, right? The same access modifier, no arg, and a call to super. Now, whenever you try to create an instance of this, you would be calling this, if you do something like new understand call flow with the default, if you try to invoke a default constructor, so this would be called, and super would be invoked, so which is this with the default here. Okay, so this one has been added by the compiler because this is all the code you have in A, so the compiler adds a super call. Now class B doesn't have any explicit constructor, so the compiler added this here. Okay, now if you were to do something like this, this would invoke this constructor, which first would invoke super constructor, which is this one. So this one would invoke this, and this invokes objects constructor because B extends object class, and object invokes its object. So this invokes objects constructor, which would be executed and returned. So now the control from B returns to A and prints this, and then after this the control returns back to this line here.